Well, I was a Cub reporter covering that interop conference. And so, at the beginning of my career as a reporter, I covered networking,
Wow.
which confused almost everybody in my family. They didn't know what I was doing. And I imagine that might have been true for people outside of your direct, colleagues.
Absolutely. I tried to explain to people what I was doing, and they would look at me like I was crazy. I mean,
Yeah.
computers are these things in air-conditioned rooms, and why would you interconnect them anyway? And blah, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah.
So
So,
I want to fast forward to today, Vin, and ask you, we're in it. It certainly feels like another significant inflection point for the internet as a platform, as a set of technologies that are interconnected, broadly under the header of artificial intelligence. It feels to me, as an observer of the space for 35 years, that it might be similar to other milestones we've seen, over the years. You named, graphical user interfaces or the World Wide Web. Others have said it's as significant as the iPhone. But when I asked you this question earlier, you had a really interesting answer. So I wanted to prompt you to give it to me again, which is, how big a deal is this? Is there a moment in the history of computing that is as significant as the one we're in now?
I absolutely believe so, for a lot of different reasons. And let me put this into two pieces of context. One of them is the internet itself and the applications that are running on it right now. For many years, John Perry Barlow's beautiful vision of an open internet where everybody shares information with each other and we all sing kumbaya. We clearly know in 2024 that the situation is a little more complex than that there is harmful behavior on the network. It's amplified by various and sundry applications, including social media, among others, and that we have to do something about that. Nation states are starting to recognize that. They're trying to pass laws, there are international treaties. I just got off the phone with an hour of discussion about a cybercrime treaty that the US is representing the American position on. So it's well recognized that this system is, I won't say out of control, but I would say that there is increasing concern about the potential hazards and harms that this online environment creates. So that's one kind of state of affairs. The second thing, with regard to the state of computing right now, for many, many years, two of my colleagues, Dave Patterson and John Hennessy, who's the chairman of the board of Google, in their independent roles at Stanford and Berkeley, came up with what's called the reduced instruction set computer, the RISC design. And that has been the workhorse of the design of computer chips for years and years. We have reached a point now where specialization and heterogeneity is our friend, and we are deeply dependent on specialization in order to achieve increased gains in computing capability. What does that translate into? Well, at Google, it translates into having a variety of computers in our data centers: conventional central processing units, specialized graphical processing units, tensor processing units for specialized inference in machine learning. Someday, maybe quantum processing units. We're still trying to make these things function in a useful way. So we're seeing a transformation in computing capability and type of computing, type of problems that these things are well adapted to solving. That's super exciting. The large language model aspect of machine learning has triggered yet another highly speculative view of what machine learning and artificial intelligence can do. The problem that we have right now is that the way it does it is predictable. And in fact, you hear terms like hallucination, where factual material is conflated into counterfactual output by these extraordinary programs, machine learning mechanisms that are not yet reliable for all possible applications. So this is a super exciting time for almost anyone who's interested in computing and communications, to say nothing of the fact that we have more access to internet than ever, thanks to the Starlink and other low Earth orbiting satellites in addition to the mobiles that we carry, which are also increasingly capable, as is things like Wi-Fi in people's homes, buildings, public facilities. This is a time of enormous, I would say, potential, and I'm quite excited about the rest of this decade.
Yeah. And could you compare it to a time in the history of compute? Would you say it's comparable to the dawn of the web, or more comparable to the dawn of programmable computers themselves?
I would say that the dawn of programmable computers is sort of that's where we are. That was the beginning of an enormous period of elaborate invention and development. Software is sort of the ultimate clay. There's no limit to it. It's only limited by your imagination and ability to program. So we're at a point now where we have more diverse clay than we ever had before. We have more capacity than we ever had before, both in terms of scale, transmission data rates, computing power, memory, and everything else. So from my point of view, the sky is the limit for new applications of these kinds of devices. So I'm as excited in this period as I would have been, I think, in the earlier time when computing first rolls out in commercial form in, say, the 1950s.
Yeah, well, that's a date that hasn't come up much, the 1950s, in when people think about the history of the internet. I want to ask you to sort of reflect on what you think the greatest impact on democracy and how we govern ourselves has been of these technologies.
Well, many of us had hoped that democracy would be enhanced as a consequence of the internet's existence and all the devices that it can service, our ability to reach information at our fingertips, which I still think is astonishing. I mean, I was sitting at a dinner party last night in a fancy restaurant. A question came up. Somebody pulled out their mobile and did a little Google search and got the answer. And, there we are. And, 50 years ago, you would never imagine it was possible to do that. You get up and, run off to find the Encyclopedia Britannica to get answers. So the fact that we can do that is still very remarkable from my point of view. However, we're also faced with all of the potential hazards of misinformation, disinformation, the fragmentation of discussion into these what do you call it? Confirmation bias vacuoles. And it's the groups of people that believe in certain things, and they only look at the evidence that reinforces that belief. It creates polarization. And to say nothing of all of the various real harms that take place, whether it's ransomware or malware or denial of service attacks or other kinds of fraud and abuse and everything else. So we are in a fairly contentious environment right now, and the natural reaction is to try to get control of that somehow. So that's why you see a lot of legislation being passed and debated and discussed. I worry that we don't have a depth of understanding of the dynamics of all this technology that would inform our choices of legislation and law.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you pass a law, can you actually enforce it?
Right.
I have to tell you, back in the probably early part of the 20th century, probably in the mid parts of the 20th century, there was a little French village that had a lot of vineyards. And the mayor decided to have a law passed that said no UFOs were allowed to land in the vineyards. So 50 years later, they had a great celebration that the law was effective, that no UFOs had landed in the vineyards in the past 50 years. This is a classic category error on the part of the legislators. So we still lack, I think, a firm understanding of what kinds of laws make sense and how they'll be enforced.
And we were discussing it earlier, Vint. You mentioned something that I wanted you to unpack when it comes to thinking about how to create legislation, say on the impact of artificial intelligence on society. You said you advocated for focusing on use and not on the
Yes.
technology themselves.
Yes.
Can you say a bit more about what you mean by that?
Yes, thank you. This came up in the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning and the large language models. These are startling inventions. Some of them do things that we never imagined they could do. For example, one of our colleagues at Google had just presented a prompt to a chatbot saying, please reverse this random string of characters, which it did. And then it said, oh, by the way, here's the Python program that does that. Now, none of us were expecting it to go write a Python program, and it worked. So there are things that these complex systems can do that we didn't anticipate. The problem is that we don't understand this deeply enough to write rules about how they run and how they work. The better tactic, in my opinion, is to say, well, what are people using these for? If it's pure entertainment, that's fairly low risk. You give it a prompt, it produces. I asked it to write a story about an alien that got into my wine cellar and was surviving on my Cabernet Sauvignon. And it wrote a little story about a Martian who'd gotten into the wine cellar. And I considered that to be innocuous. Now, there are arguments about the use of these technologies for generating entertainment, which might run into some intellectual property problems. For example, if you use a famous person's face or voice or whatever, without their permission, there's some questions about whether you should be allowed to do that or not. But setting that aside, the entertainment side is relatively innocuous. But as you start working your way up the risk factor layers, when you get towards the top, you're talking about financial advice, medical diagnosis, and medical treatment. The last thing in the world you should do is use a chatbot to get advice about investing, unless there's some evidence that the party who put that thing together has actually taken significant steps to prevent it from giving you bad advice. Right. And of course, I'm not sure even now what evidence you would offer to say that you protected against that.
Right. Other than perhaps that organization's willingness to take some liability, I suppose.
Well, yeah, exactly. And so that raises really interesting questions about who's liable for what. It's just like the argument about when the self-driving car runs into something, who's liable. And I don't think we have good answers to that yet.
Yeah. A lot of the discussion around these topics of how do we regulate, should we regulate AI, tend to focus on the negative case. But I wanted to ask you how you think these new technologies might help us be better citizens, better at governing ourselves. How can AI strengthen democracy?
Well, boy, that's a good question. Again, the worry that I have is that if you use an artificial intelligence large language model to ask questions and get answers back, the problem that I foresee is that you may not be confident that the answer you got back is valid. And so we still have a lot of work to do to find a way to verify that the output from this bot has validation, has, what is the provenance of the information that it used in order to compose the answer. Just to give you an example of the trickiness here, I asked it to write an obituary for me, thinking that that was a well-defined form, that it would have encountered obituaries in the course of imbibing much of the World Wide Web. So it did produce an obituary, and the format was as you would expect. We're sorry Dr. Cerf passed away. It gave a date, which I found slightly unsettling.
Was it in the future?
Yeah, well, yeah, but not far enough. So then it produced a rendering of my career. But while it was doing that, or when it did that, it gave me credit for stuff I didn't do, and it gave other people credit for stuff I did, which was disappointing. And then when it got to the remaining family members, it made up family members that, as far as I know, I don't have. So the problem we run into is that if we would like to use these as important sources of information that we use to exercise our democratic rights to vote, among other practices, we really need help figuring out whether or not the information we get back is valid. And of course, a big problem that humans have is that confirmation bias is quite natural. If the thing comes back with stuff that I believe in, even if it's wrong, I'll accept that. So we still have work to do to figure out how to make these kinds of systems produce reliable and verifiable output. My one of my favorite scenarios here is that if you asked a question and you got back an answer, you should be able to ask more questions about getting validity, like what information was used to compose the answer? Can you show me the websites that might have been sources of content? Are there any corroborating assertions from sources that I would trust? So there are a bunch of things that I would wish that we would do. Now, a lot of people don't want to do that because it takes work. And it's an illustration of critical thinking.
Yeah.
Where you
Yeah.
ask, where does this stuff come from? Is there corroborating evidence and so on? So I now believe that critical thinking may be an important skill that we should employ in order to make use of these advanced mechanisms in our pursuit of democracy. But we need to be smart about the way we use the data.
Well, an audience member just mentioned that he's tried that with ChatGPT and it made URLs up. And it is interesting how Google, where you now hang your hat, really was built on this citation, almost academic citation framework. The citations were links, of course, and you had to be careful about whether or not you believed what was on the page that was linked to.
Absolutely.
And therefore you needed critical thinking, right?
Yeah.
But this has been a problem so far, the opaqueness of these systems, and I think that's what you're referring to. And I'm a big supporter of figuring out how we can get more transparency into the system.
As do I. I mean, people need agency in order to exercise this critical thinking. So the designs of these systems need to take into account a desirable property, which is that it is capable of responding to you by telling you what the provenance of the content is. And you can then decide, perhaps on your own, whether or not you accept the provenance as an indication of accuracy of what comes back out.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to go back.
Just to suggest something, I harp on this critical thinking thing all the time, and I finally realized that you could boil this down to an internet driver's license. Think about what we do with teenagers. We run them. We insist that we run them through these training programs, and we show them what car crashes do, and to people and to property and so on. We warn them that other drivers are less competent than they are, and they should drive defensively, and all this stuff. We even give them a test before we give them a driver's license that lets them drive the car. Now, I'm not arguing that people should necessarily pass a test before they can use the internet, but I do think the kind of training that we do to help people be safe on the road could be an analog of that, could be helpful to people who are going to use the internet, so they are aware of the risk factors.
Yeah.
And how to cope with them.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's sort of a literacy, if you will,
in a sense, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you a question, then there's sort of a follow-up that I noticed from one of the esteemed members of the audience, Esther Dyson.
Esther is a dear friend, so I'm glad he's listening.
And I went to Esther's conferences for as many years as I possibly could. But the first question I have is, if you could go back over the last 30 or 40 years of internet history and sort of maybe time travel and land somewhere and change a set of, I'll let you get that.
Well, it will ring 2 more times.
All right. Well, if you could change,
It's a politician asking for money. Normally I answer in Russian and they hang up.
If you could go back in time and change something, that maybe a decision that was taken or a path that was embarked upon as it related to something in the internet's structural or technological or social history, what might it be?
Well, the first obvious one is that I would start with 128 bits of address space instead of 32. But I can just imagine, my 80-year-old self whispering in the ear of my 30-year-old self, you're going to need 128 bits of address space. My reaction back then would have been, are you out of your cotton picking mind? That's more than there are electrons in the universe. And of course, at the time, we went through some reasoning and said, for development purposes, the 32-bit address space should be more than enough. We're not going to have more than, say, 256 of these experimental networks anyway. And if it ever did get out, that's 2 per country. That ought to be enough for competition. And then we allowed for 16 million computers in each network. And at the time, 1973, computers were these big, honking big pieces of equipment in air-conditioned rooms, and they didn't get up and run around and so on. So I don't think that I would have been able to sell the idea of 128-bit address space at the time that we were doing.
Right.
So even if I believed what I was hearing from my 80-year-old self, I would have had trouble selling that. Some people have said, why didn't you put more security into the system? And once again, I don't think that would have worked very well. The people who were designing, building, and using the system were graduate students for all practical purposes, and they are not the first cohort you go to find disciplined use of cryptographic keys. They get distracted by homework and final exams and dissertations and so on. And so even though I was working with the National Security Agency on secured versions of the system, using link and end-to-end packet crypto, which, by the way, we had to invent packet crypto in order to get this to work. That was not a scenario. That was a scenario that made sense for the Defense Department, but it didn't make much sense at the time that we were doing the development. Now, today, that's a whole other story. And you notice that people who use the World Wide Web almost exclusively use HTTPS for end-to-end cryptography to protect the integrity of and the confidentiality of the exchanges that are taking place. There's no doubt that that's important and needs to be, in fact, emphasized increasingly, to say nothing of digital signatures to authenticate origins and integrity of bit integrity of the content.
So here's the follow-up from Esther. This is specific to the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, where you helped get that organization spun up and funded, and were chair for many years. Esther's question is, what do you see as the greatest success and the greatest failure of ICON?
Well, first of all, Esther was the first chair. And I was present at the board meeting where she was elected chair, and she served the organization well for the time that she served in that position. I succeeded her in the early 2000s. So I would say that the greatest success is it still exists. It had extracted itself from government oversight, which was a thorn in the side of most other countries other than the US. And the internet continues to work. The domain name system works. The IP address allocation system works. I wouldn't call it a failure exactly, but I will say that it is a barnacle encrusted institution. The solution for almost everything is to create a new committee or a new support organization or some new procedure or what have you. It is a very complex and in some cases confusing system. But in spite of all that, it is, I think, quite astonishing that the internet continues to function in spite of the evolution, which has grown on almost all dimensions by about 7 orders of magnitude. The system is 10 million times bigger than it was when it was first turned on in 1983. In almost all dimensions, number of computers, number of users, bandwidth that's available in the optical fiber networks, and so on. So it has survived, and we need to give it credit for that. On the other hand, I already alluded to some of the challenges that we see in this online environment, socioeconomic challenges in particular, political challenges. ICANN is not the place to solve any of that. It is not a content focused organization. It should not be, in my opinion. It's there to make sure that the basic naming and addressing infrastructure works to assure that the names and the addresses are uniquely assigned. But the application space is outside of its purview,
Right.
and it should resist being drawn into that side. It's already complicated enough as it is.
Yeah. A reminder to those on the stream, you can put questions into the chat while Vint speaks Russian to another politician.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm going to ask you to do your Freud bit later, Vint.
Yes, I'll do that. Okay.
But we have a question from Gentry Lane. State-sponsored persistent cyber aggression on civilian infrastructure is rendering cyberspace untenable and threatens the continuity of critical goods and services. Is cyber conflict an intrinsic component of the internet?
So I think the answer is not that it's an intrinsic component of the internet. It is an intrinsic component of human society. We will find new battlefields, and at this point, the internet and the World Wide Web represent a new battlefield where conflict can occur. And it occurs between nation states. It occurs between interested parties, criminal elements, and the rest of society. It is a place in which competition takes place among various corporate entities. So it really is another space in which this kind of conflict can occur. I mean, we have air, land, sea, and now we have this virtual environment. And that, of course, is a challenge because we would like, I think I would like anyway, to make it less likely that space is harmful to be in. And in order for that to be a true statement, well, we need to have international agreement and cooperation about what's acceptable and what is not acceptable behavior online. And speaking even more broadly, forget about the online nature of the internet. The software world is enormous. And even without networking, we still rely unbelievably heavily on programmable things. I mean, when you think about your mobile, for instance, we use it, those of us who have them, and that's a significant fraction of the world's population, rely on them for an amazing number of things. And you get cascade failures that can happen, right? If I'm going to log in to a service online, sometimes I'm going to need to log into my mobile in order to get a second password or a second authenticator from the site that's serving me. So I use my username and password, and it says, well, I don't trust that, so I'm sending you something on your mobile. If you can't log into your mobile, or if you get logged into the mobile but it doesn't have service, then that's not going to work.
Right.
And then you can't log into your email. If you can't get logged into your email, then you can't get the message that's going to save your company from going bankrupt. And, that's sort of an extreme cascade failure. But I'm nervous that we rely so heavily on these things. I would really, frankly, wish that other devices besides the mobile could be used to satisfy these various functions. So my laptop and my desktop or my pad or something could be an alternative to the mobile for a lot of these functions. But unfortunately, that's not the case.
Yeah. I'm curious if you could wave a wand and implement one global rule to make the internet better or perhaps to govern AI in a way that you think would be beneficial. How would you use that one wish?
Wow. I'm not sure that I can boil it down to, using Harry Potter's wand to make the world better. Let me suggest, this is controversial, and it would be interesting to see if anyone wants to joust on the topic, but I have become increasingly persuaded that anonymity is not our friend in this online world. It is useful and important under certain conditions, but I believe that accountability is becoming an increasingly important element in this space. And that parties who are misbehaving in particular need to become accountable. And in order for that to happen, we have to be able to identify them. We may have to get help across international boundaries because a perpetrator could be in one jurisdiction and the victim in another. None of this is easy. I mentioned earlier, the cybercrime treaty is a very complex piece of agreement, and it's right now fraught with debate. But we do need to have cooperation and collaboration across between willing parties in order to hold parties accountable. Now, some people would legitimately say, but what about whistleblowers? And I would say, yes, that's an issue. But I don't think that in most whistleblower scenarios, the party who's receiving the blown whistle often needs to know who the party is, but is obligated to keep that party's identity private or confidential. So we know of reporters, for example, who have gone to jail protecting their sources because that is an ethic which is very common in high quality journalism. So I think in that particular case, the party to whom the whistle was blown may need to know who that party is and to add validity to the report that's coming. So I think identity and accountability are very much combined together. I also think, though, that there is an agency element to all this. In addition to holding parties accountable, we have to give the users of the system, whether it's people or companies or countries, agency to protect themselves. So we need to give them tools like two-factor authentication, like end-to-end encryption, and other kinds of mechanisms in order to make it safer and more reliable. So redundancy, more backup capability, all kinds of things like that need to be a part of this environment in order to improve the safety and security of the system that we're increasingly depending on.
Are there any governance models that are emerging right now that you see? For example, there are some pretty robust ones coming out of the EU around artificial intelligence that concern you, and if so, why?
Well, you picked the EU and artificial intelligence, which is a toxic mix. First of all, my view of the EU, with no disrespect intended, is that they tend to look at new environments, new technologies, and they say something bad might happen, we have to regulate it. And in America, it's a little different. It's sort of like something bad has happened, we need to regulate it. So the Europeans tend to get out in front. And in some cases, that's arguably a useful thing, like the general data protection rules. Although it's my view that those general data protection rules have run afoul of law enforcement, because law enforcement needs to know, and the data protection rules say, no, you don't. And so you often end up with these peculiar conflicting regimes that somehow need to be resolved. So I think trying to literally regulate artificial intelligence or machine learning or large language models is premature, because I don't think we understand well enough what the rules should be to constrain their misbehavior. That's why earlier I was arguing that we should look at the applications and say whether or not the parties offering applications based on those technologies should show evidence of safety for the consumers of those applications when they're in the high risk space. Now, that might imply, as I think you said, that the party offering those services should be ready to assume some liability in the event that the high risk thing causes harm.
Yeah. Well, as long as we're talking about potential harm, I'll raise Adam Sullivan's question, which has been hanging out in the chat for a minute, which is related to artificial intelligence, generalized artificial intelligence. The question is, how close are we to the singularity?
Well, it depends on who you ask. And of course, my colleague at Google would tell you that the singularity is nearer. In fact, his latest book is titled that. His original book was The Singularity is Near. Now he's saying his most recent book is The Singularity is Nearer. He makes a very, very potent argument. Yes, Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry, I should have said that. So his latest book, which I read recently, is pretty persuasive. I will say that the metric by which we might understand where we are in terms of singularity is not just the number of components in the system, it's the connectivity. The brain doesn't work very well without extraordinary connectivity. I mean, some nerves have 10,000 interconnects with other nerves. So we don't fully understand all that yet. So I don't think that we are quite as close to the singularity as I would imagine it. However, what we have seen with the large language models is the capacity to do stuff that we would not have imagined these systems could do. Even if they are faulty at it, they are still doing pretty remarkable things. So the Turing test, as it was previously formulated by Turing, is no longer a very useful test. In fact, I would suggest for consideration that the fact that a large language model can pass the written bar exam or pass the, what's the other one? The bar, the medical exams, does not make a bot a doctor or a lawyer.
Right.
And so this verisimilitude of human discourse that comes out of the large language models should not be misunderstood as capacity to act in these special professions. And so we now need, we now need different and better metrics for assessing the capability of these kinds of large language models or whatever comes from that. I think some people, including me, believe that the large language model formulation is inadequate to doing things that you and I would agree are comparable to human conduct. It can do things that we can't do. For example, it can handle 100 languages,
Right.
and it can do so with a certain degree of reliability. Very few human beings could do that. And there are a number of other things that these large language models are capable of doing at scale that you and I can't do. But that does not mean that it can do some of the things like being a doctor or being a lawyer or some other professional.
Right, right. As we sort of round in the last few minutes here of the hour, I do want to maybe cast our eye forward a bit. There's a question from Jay Allen in the audience. You briefly touched on quantum computing, but Jay Allen asks, what will the eventual effect of quantum computing, what might it be on the internet? Will the positive effects outweigh possible negative ones?
Well, first of all, I'm very excited about quantum computing. And of course, Google has made considerable investment in designing and building this particular kind of computing engine. They are best at certain classes of problems like optimization. And without getting into a lot of the details, there is one thing that it can do is well known, and that's the Shor's algorithm that lets it break factorization. And the reason that's important is that our current cryptographic mechanisms have historically used the difficulty of factoring the products of large primes as the work factor protecting encrypted information. Now, we can keep increasing the keys to defend against a quantum attack, but eventually that won't work. And so the National Institutes of Standards and Technology have already invited propositions for new encrypting algorithms and digital signature algorithms that do not suffer from the possibility of a Shor's quantum attack. And those are already being adopted at Google, for example, in order to protect information now that may need to be protected for the next 25 years. So I'm very excited about quantum computing. In some ways, the analogy I would use is that if you remember VisiCalc on the Apple IIe or the Apple II Plus, which meant you could do real-time exploration of the spreadsheet, plug in different values, see what happens in real time. I think quantum computing will allow us to explore solution spaces in real time. So we can crawl around looking at optimum solutions of complex problems using quantum computing. And that will be as exciting as it was to do real-time spreadsheets, for example.
What do you think the time, how do we think about time going forward, Vin? I mean, we in this conversation, we've dated ourselves to the 1950s, and 35 years later, you said the commercial internet started to become pretty apparent to you at a conference in the late 1980s, and then roughly 5-10 years later, the World Wide Web, and and then another 30 years, here we are. Is that the time frame that we should be thinking about going forward, or are things going to look very different in a shorter time?
I wish that I had, a really clear crystal ball. I don't. I will say, though, that from what I have seen, quantum computing is already available in some measure. IBM has a commercial offering already. I don't quite know when ours will become available in literally, but I've seen scenarios that make 5 years very believable and maybe even less than that. So I see that scaling. The big challenge there, by the way, is error correction. The ability to have a large number of physical qubits that emulate a logical one, so that the computation can continue even while the entanglement is starting to get weak. You use the physical multiple qubits in order to constitute a reliable logical qubit, but it could take 1,000,000 physical qubits to model 1,000 logical ones. So I think that's relatively near term. We will see applications.
But then I'm actually asking, when you think about how different the overall internet space is and its impact on society from, its emergence in the late 80s, early 1990s to now, how long will it be before it's as different in the future as it is from, say, 25, 30 years ago? Will it be another 25, 30 years, or do you think things are going to change
I think
rapidly?
Much closer. I think that the Internet of Things, where we put computing capability and communications capability into devices that surround us, I think that's already here in many respects, and it's coming fast. That does raise all kinds of questions about how brittle is that technology? How dependent is it on the network? What if the network doesn't work? Will we have? Oh, there's a great book that everybody should read. It's a short novella by E.M. Forster, the title of which is "The Machine Stops." It was written in 1909.
Novella, yeah.
It describes a society that looks a lot like ours did during the pandemic. Everybody is at home, food gets delivered, we communicate online, we never see each other face to face. And in the opening scenario of the novel, the machine stops working. And the question is, what happens to that society? So we have the risk of that possibility, I think, of becoming very dependent on these systems and having them not resilient enough. Of course, then there's always the catastrophic case is the one where we have the sun has a coronal mass expulsion, which reaches the Earth and wipes out all of the electronics on the planet. The power system gets wiped out, all of the electronics gets wiped out, and we are back to even before the invention of the telegraph and the telephone.
Well, now we're describing many of the main plot features of the largest blockbuster science fiction movies.
Yes, exactly.
And we are at the top of the hour, and I want to honor everybody's time commitment that they've made for the hour, and especially yours, Vint. So I want to thank you very much for joining us and the Burns Center and Northeastern in this conversation. It's been lovely.
Well, I wonder if we can ask everybody to indulge me with one more observation. You and I talked about this, but we're all worried about artificial intelligence and everything else. And so I've been pretending to be Sigmund Freud. What we have now is the artificial id and the artificial ego. And what we are missing now is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. So I think that we will be coping with these phenomena over the next decade or so. I could not imagine a more exciting time when technology is taking us for a new ride.
Me too. Absolutely. Vint, thank you so much for joining us, and thanks to everybody. And appreciate all your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to every one of them. And don't forget to sign up for all of the lecture series that the Burns Center and Northeastern has available to you. All of that in the chat and on the Burns Center website. Again, thank you very much.
See you on the net, John.
See you there.